All right, let's observe time in the interests of those watching in cyberspace on the YouTube. This is the fourth panel where the question of supporting an international anti-corruption court is under discussion. We're hoping that Lord Hain will join us remotely. We understand that he's in a train at the moment, but that there is every prospect of him joining the meeting. Now I'm going to hand over to the moderator of the last panel, and if Lord Hain does not arrive, then I will do my personal impersonation of Lord Hain.
And if he does arrive, you can impersonate Paul Hoffman. Right. Well, welcome to you all to the fourth and last panel. We're moving, as Paul has indicated, from the domestic terrain to the international. Internationally, corruption is estimated to cost trillions of dollars annually. Huge number. The Washington-based organization Global Financial Integrity found that from 2000 to 2009, developing countries lost $8.44 trillion to illicit financial flows, 10 times more than the sum of foreign aid they received over the same period of time, which is really quite a mind-boggling statistic. What I want to talk about in these brief introductory remarks is a branch of international corruption, that is kleptocracy. Kleptocracy is constituted by the theft by a nation's leaders of the state funds for their own use. It accounts for a substantial part of global corruption. Putting an end to kleptocracy and recovering the assets stolen by corrupt leaders, kleptocrats, would enable many millions of the poorest in our world, and particularly on our continent, to be adequately housed, clothed, and fed. That so many kleptocrats succeed with their nefarious conduct is not because of a lack of domestic laws. There are 189 parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, which was referred to earlier today. Of the 189 member states, of the 189 members of UNCAC, 181 are governments, nations. Most of them have complied with their obligations under UNCAC to have appropriate domestic anti-corruption legislation. The Convention obliges all states parties to have adequate anti-corruption domestic laws. Needless to say, most of them have it, and needless to say, huge numbers of them simply ignore those laws. To enable their criminal activities, kleptocrats have gutted their criminal justice system. They've taken control of the prosecuting authority, the police, and frequently the courts. It is in those cases that there is a legal vacuum. There's really no international institution that can enforce, that constitutes an enforcement mechanism. There are billions of dollars of stolen assets laundered by kleptocrats in a number of countries. They include not only the usual suspects, but they include the United Kingdom, some states in the United States of America, Singapore, Monaco, United Arab Emirates, and there are others, a number of others. If some of those countries would join an international anti-corruption court, the stolen assets could be frozen, repurposed, and at the right time repatriated to the countries from which they were stolen. And it may well politically, and it's all a question of politics, it may well politically pay and be in the interest of some of those states to join an international anti-corruption court and put the obligation on such an institution rather than attract the political ire of some of the countries from which the assets come. They could be used to benefit the real victims, the millions of needy people in those countries from which the monies have been stolen. A senior federal judge in Boston, Mark Wolf, is leading a campaign to establish an international anti-corruption court, the IACC. Together, Mark and I launched a civil society organization called Integrity Initiatives International, III. I'm happy to say that Paul Hoffman is also a member of the board of III. Its broad mission is to fight corruption, and its main project is to establish the IACC. I would emphasize that the IACC, the International Anti-Corruption Court, is not seen as a panacea that will put an end to kleptocracy. It could be one of the many tools, domestic and international, that are required to help in that area. III strongly supports other effective tools to counter corruption. The envisaged IACC would have jurisdiction over crimes committed by nationals of an IACC member state, nationals of a member state, and crimes committed in the territory of a member state. It could be established and quickly become effective if it consisted initially of even a few relatively representative states, as long as they include some financial centres and other attractive destinations where kleptocrats frequently launder, hide, and spend their stolen assets. In this way, the IACC would have the potential to prosecute, punish, and recover illicit assets from kleptocrats who rule countries that might not initially join the court. If the IACC during its early years demonstrates that it can work effectively and efficiently, many other countries are likely to join in the endeavour. In the aftermath of kleptocratic government, some small countries might not have the human and financial resources to fight kleptocracy and could approach the IACC to come to their assistance. Since July of last year, there have been significant developments with regard to the project to create the IACC. Almost 300 world leaders, including one current president, Timor-Leste, 45 former presidents and prime ministers, and 32 Nobel laureates have signed a declaration calling for the creation of the IACC. 3 governments have made the establishment of the IACC an element of their official foreign policy. They're the Netherlands, Canada, and Ecuador. They convened a high-level roundtable at the end of November of last year in The Hague. At the roundtable ministerial session, 7 of the 14 countries represented indicated an interest in such a court. I add that in January last month, Nigeria became the 4th country to publicly state its commitment to working with other states towards the establishment of the IACC. The court would be subject to the principle of complementarity. That means that the IACC would be a court of last instance, and it would acquire jurisdiction only in cases in which the appropriate domestic authorities are unable or unwilling to investigate or prosecute the corruption. There are many lessons to be learned from the experience of the ICC. The International Criminal Court has been beset by many problems since its inception. The majority of them, I would dare say, are unforeseen and unforeseeable, but they've been identified. And an International Anti-Corruption Court would be able to benefit from the experience of the International Criminal Court. So this panel will examine from different perspectives the establishment of the International Anti-Corruption Court. I'm particularly happy to welcome Mwila Bwanga, who has come to us from Lusaka, to give us a perspective from outside South Africa. So Mwila, over to you.
Thank you so much, Justice Goldstone. I think Justice Goldstone has already established the framework and the narrative that we desire to see from IAC, I love to call it. Greetings from Zambia and from my president, Hakainde Hichilema. I think it's always important that when you're in such a space, you take the opportunity to do so. I think even what I'm going to do is that in my submission, I would talk about the importance of the ICC, of IAC from an African perspective, and also why as young leaders, we should take IAC as an important initiative that we have to advance with everything that we have. Before I quickly get into my submission, allow me to just give you a bit of a brief story. So in the year 2021, I contested for election as a member of parliament for Nchanga constituency in my hometown, Chingola in Zambia. I was the youngest that was contesting for that particular seat. And in a race of 5 candidates, I was able to come out third. I was able to pull out a great number of votes. I may not know how that happened, but I believe I spoke well to the people. So during my campaign trail, one of the things that I stood on, one of the things that I was talking about is the need to curb the amount of corruption that was taking place at district level. Because what was happening is that the resources that are supposed to be allocated towards healthcare were being allocated to better the health standards of people's pockets. The resources that were supposed to be allocated, to infrastructure development and so on and so forth were being allocated to people's pockets. So what I did during my campaign trail is that I tried by all means to speak against, that kind of, political behavior that was taking place. And then, during my campaign trail, as I was on radio and then I left, a gentleman called me and he said, Mwila, the kind of politics that you're trying to play will not play out because, truth be told, it's corruption that drives the wheel of politics. And that in itself shows, ladies and gentlemen, the extent to which we have normalized grant corruption. We have reached a point where corruption is now just something that we talk about in the intellectual corridors. We have reached a point where corruption is just something that we talk about when the need arises. And we have basically normalize the whole entire idea. Many speakers have talked about how corruption at the grassroots level is what then culminates at a global level. In my country, you're going to find a situation that if you've been caught by the police, the only thing you have to do is to give them a handshake with a little bit of money in your hand, and you'll be allowed to pass. And that in itself perpetuates in many other countries. And, just 3 weeks ago, my wife gave birth to a bouncing baby boy. And then, yay, thank you. And one of the things I started asking myself is, what kind of a society do I want this young man to grow up in? And I think for me it came, to the realization that I want this young man to grow up in a society where we no longer normalize corruption. And I believe that IAC would be the first step to actualizing that particular vision, ladies and gentlemen. Now, when we talk about the whole entire issue of grant corruption, as Justice Goldstone has also established, we have to understand that corruption in itself, it has a particular way in which it affects development in many other ways. Right now, as we speak, as an African continent, we're trying to advance what we are calling the Agenda 2063. Now, it becomes difficult for us to realize that particular agenda when we understand that the leaders who have to work extremely hard to bring all those amazing 7 aspirations of the Agenda 2063 to reality are not allocating resources accordingly. Corruption in itself, ladies and gentlemen, perpetuates poverty. Just a few years ago, in fact, a few months back, we've been struggling with the issue of having medical supplies in our country, in our hospitals, to a point where when you go to a hospital, you'll be given a prescription and then you'll be told to go to a chemist and you buy your own medicine. Now, for people that can afford, I think it's a necessity that definitely they can do that. But after the Auditor General's report was released, it was stated that the resources that were supposed to be allocated to purchasing medical supplies and to be put in various hospital facilities were basically allocated to certain individuals' pockets. And that in itself shows the reason as to why we have to bring this idea to reality. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached a point where we have strong leaders but weak institutions. We have reached a point where we have strong men and women in power, but when we look at the institutions that we have, the institutions are not as strong as the men and women that intend to govern over the affairs of our land. I think it should be on page number 48 of Paul's book, Countering the Corrupt. And one of the things that is written in that book, there's an amazing quote that I captured, which stated that the untouchable, come rain, come sunshine, they will never stand before the courts of law. And that in itself shows why it's important for us to advance this profound agenda of the International Anti-Corruption Court. Allow me to also state, ladies and gentlemen, that corrupt practices engineered by a single person in a particular nation impairs the security of all in such a nation. A single political leader who engineers corrupt practices in a particular nation impairs the security of all in that particular nation. So we cannot stand back and say the person who's being corrupt in this particular nation is only one person. It's one person who then later on intends, to build a new cadre of new leaders who intend to be corrupt as him or her. And that is why we have noticed that many political leaders on the African continent, they fail to give up power. Why? Because they know that if they left office, they will be held up to account. So they choose to hold on a little bit because they understand that the institutions that they have put in place is what safeguards their corrupt brand in one way or another. So why the International Anti-Corruption Court? For me, ladies and gentlemen, IAC is just not an idea. It's an idea it's not just an idea worth fantasizing. It is an idea worth actualizing, a reality worth realizing. We shouldn't just be here to advance the agenda and say it's important for us to have. And I know that many third world countries, including African nations, will say that some of these international bodies, they are basically established to arm twist third world leaders. And that is why we have noticed that we're going to have probably a certain kind of laissez-faire approach from certain leaders, because they might say that the ICC is only there for third world leaders. The International Criminal Court of Justice is only there for third world leaders. So the International Anti-Corruption Court will only be there for third world leaders. So I think we owe it to ourselves as Africans, ladies and gentlemen, to be in the forefront of advancing this particular agenda. May the African voices be heard as we advance the cause of the International Anti-Corruption Court. And why is the IAC also important? During the 2021 Summit for Democracy, I was privileged to speak alongside U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And during my speech, one of the things that I stated, and I quote, "Curbing grand corruption will forever remain an agenda built on rhetoric if we do not establish independent institutions that curb the present reality of strong leaders but weak institutions." And that is why we have noticed that some of the pillars of the Summit for Democracy is to curb corruption and to bring to book some of the kleptocratic leaders that we have in our time. I'll end there for now, as I also allow for another speaker to come in, and then maybe later on I'll be able to share on the role that young leaders can play to bring the International Anti-Corruption Court to fruition. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Mwila, for your passion. I think it's exactly what we need, and especially from young people. Marianne, over to you.
Thank you, Justice Goldstone, and also to Accountability Now and Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung and the funders of this event, and also just welcome to UCT. It's great to actually be on campus, and I don't take it for granted that we can physically share a space, and it's been a real treat to meet in person with people one hasn't seen for a while. But thank you for the opportunity. I just want to make it very clear up front that I am not a lawyer. And I'm not an international lawyer, and so I feel very humbled by the presence of all the judges here who've done extraordinary work in this field. But I am interested in institutions that promote accountability. And I think the idea of an international anti-corruption court is interesting. So that sounds a little bit non-committal, and I think part of it is because I've come late to the party. I realize that since 2014, Justice Wolf has been getting people together, and Triple I has been formed, and somehow all of that passed me by. I'm familiar a little bit with the work of the International Criminal Court, and my sense is that the idea of an IACC will build on the lessons from that experience, which, just talking to some of my friends who do work in international criminal law and accountability, are somewhat skeptical of the role that the ICC has played. Now, what I liked about the paper that I read from Justice Goldstone was the humility, if you like, around the approach, which is the progressing proposal. So from an idea to an institution, you want to get it right. We want to get it right. And so my skepticism is very open to being countered. On the other hand, having read some of the work of Matthew Stevenson at Harvard, who's an anti-corruption professor, he too remains open to persuasion. His main critique is that the IACC would have a marginal benefit in terms of the time, the attention, the money which would be spent on creating it. And so whilst I'm not against it, and I want to make that very clear, there's a sense that there may be more pressing issues for national advocates to focus on, such as asset recovery, money laundering. And so maybe it's not an either or, it's an and. And I think one has to recognize that the global corruption movement or anti-corruption movement is in need of new ideas. I mean, if you look back to where we've come from, there was the C word in the early 90s. You weren't allowed to mention the word corruption. There's an evolution which I think everyone agreed now that corruption is a human rights abuse. And I think that's becoming more and more clear when you see the impact on various aspects of our society. There's also the sense which I think advocates in the developing world have moved very carefully to counter, that corruption is just something that happens in the developing world. Corruption happens everywhere. I was talking to someone the other day, they said even the Corruption Perception Index, that the UK has fallen 5 points on the CPI. So whatever critique you might have the CPI, it seems, even though it might be a blunt instrument, it's picking up that there's something afoot, and it's not just corruption happening in developing countries, but also in developed countries. So we, as Michael Johnson and Scott Fritzen in their book, The Anti-Corruption Conundrum, saying the problem is we've been spending lots and lots of money and throwing resources and ideas. There's almost become a sort of industry around anti-corruption, but what has it actually achieved? And so what do we want? We want accountability. And there are 2 dimensions of accountability. There's the answerability, that we actually get to know what happened. And I think that's what happened with the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture in South Africa, is that we actually got a sense of what actually happened. There were answers coming to the fore. But the other dimension of accountability is enforceability. And that's where prosecution comes in, and that's where a court could come in. So there is a legal vacuum. I am persuaded by that at an international level, and being in favor of multilateralism, one would hope that something like an international anti-corruption court, which seems to have a lot of support in the last year as well by leaders across the world, is something that will come to fruition. However, there are considerations, and that's what I'd like to hear more from actually Justice Goldstone, in a sense of how one can avoid some of the pitfalls of the ICC. There is a neo-colonial imperialist critique of weaponizing international courts, and one wants to resist that. And so I was interested to hear your remarks about how particularly African youth can promote this idea. Everyone wants accountability. You can't say you're not for fighting grand corruption and you're against accountability, but we need to think carefully how we use our resources. And as advocates are exhausted. I'm talking about civil society activists around the world. And they're trying to think, how can they leverage what resources, time, energies they have to bring about accountability? Do we focus on protecting whistleblowers? How can we support investigative journalists? And what I also liked about the paper, which was shared, was drawing on the role of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and this cross-country collaboration which produced the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, the Pandora Papers, and actually produced the evidence. And what we need, if we're going to have effective and successful prosecutions in any court, is we need evidence. Now, when Hermine Cronier was saying there's no way around building capacity, I think this is where my sentiments lie, is we need to focus on where we can still build capacity create agency so that we don't see something like the IACC, which is evolving and from an idea becoming an institution with NGO and civil society support, that we don't lose track of some of the domestic, absolutely critical things which can and are being done on the ground. Because any international court will actually need to work with local jurisdictions as well and the capacities there. So how can we have both? It's not either or. It's about how can we continue to build our local domestic capacity in the criminal justice system, but also continue to think about how this IACC can fill that legal vacuum and can learn from lessons of other institutions. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Marianne. I'm going to ask Paul. I know Paul wants to give us a what-if scenario. So, Paul, incidentally, what is the latest on Lord Hain?
He's not with us. Yeah.
He's not? Okay.
When his face comes up on the screen over there, then I will put a sock in it and let him have his turn. But I think that the fact that he's not already on the screen, I don't know if Coogan's been able to get hold of him, but the fact that he's not already on the screen suggests to me that because he wanted to play off the other members of the panel, he's not joining the panel. So sorry, guys, you're stuck with me, but I promise to be short. I said at a much earlier stage when this was being prepared that I would do 2 case studies for this conference because I knew that I would be preceded by people far more learned than myself. And I think all 3 of the predecessors on this panel are more learned than I am. So let me just give you 2 factual scenarios and play them out. One, if there was indeed an IACC, and the facts, because there isn't one. So, in South Africa in 2005, a gentleman called Shabir Sheikh was convicted in the KwaZulu-Natal High Court on charges of corruption and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The factual matrix underlying that conviction was that he was in a corrupt relationship with a man called Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma at the time was the Deputy President of South Africa. He had received at an earlier stage 2 million rand of largesse from President Mandela when he didn't have enough money to pay his debts. He also, according to some encrypted faxes that appeared during the course of the Shabir Sheikh trial, received 500,000 rand a year for a couple of years from a French arms manufacturer. Jacob Zuma was fired, asked to resign by Thabo Mbeki, who was the president in 2005, and he remained on as deputy president of the ANC and used the time between his dismissal, where he was now at large to do as he saw fit, and the conference of the ANC held in 2007 in Polokwane, December 2007, to organize support for his candidacy to replace Thabo Mbeki, who was going for an unprecedented 3rd term as president of the ANC, with a view to putting perhaps a female president into the union buildings as his successor. As we all know, Jacob Zuma won in Polokwane, and one of the other significant things that happened when he won in Polokwane was that the ANC resolved as a matter of urgency that the Scorpions should be dissolved. And they were dissolved despite the efforts of Bob Glenister and the Helen Suzman Foundation and a lot of other people, some of whom became co-applicants in the first Glenister case or friends of the court when that case eventually ended up in the Constitutional Court. By 2008, Jacob Zuma was facing 783 charges of corruption, fraud, racketeering, and money laundering. And the acting National Director of Public Prosecutions, Mr. Mokotedi Mche, was prevailed upon by the leadership of the NPA to withdraw the charges that had been prepared by Vusi Pikoli and the Scorpions. And you'll remember Vusi Pikoli was first suspended for going after Jackie Selebi, who was later convicted of corruption, and then fired by Kgalema Motlanthe for going after Jacob Zuma. And the situation with Mshe was that he was satisfied that there could not be a fair trial in the matter because of the conversations that went on between a predecessor of Vusi Pikoli's and the head of the Scorpions. Totally irrelevant conversations, as it turned out. In April 2009, or was it 8? No, I think it's 2009, when the decision was communicated that the prosecution was not going to proceed, Helen Zille, then leader of the opposition, with Lindiwe Mazibuko trotting along behind her, rushed urgently to the Pretoria High Court to take the decision of the National Prosecuting Authority, or the NDPP, not to continue with the Zuma prosecution on review. That review ended, and I predicted this, on the 13th of October 2017. People asked me, how did I know that the review would eventually succeed in the Supreme Court of Appeal on the 13th of October 2017? And I said, well, it's very simple, it's my birthday. And that's in fact what happened. And since then, and at great expense and without much success, Mr. Zuma has been facing charges arising out of the same factual matrix. I think Billy Downer has done a bit more work, and there are a few more charges. Now, had there been an international anti-corruption court at the time that Helen Zille and Lindiwe Mazibuko trotted off to the Pretoria High Court, it may well, invoking the principles of complementarity, been possible to go to the International Anti-Corruption Court and to say, we cannot get justice in the South African courts. We have a problem in relation to this man's leading the ANC and standing for the presidency at a time when these charges are pending against him, and his counsel has let it be known that it is their intention to pursue a Stalingrad strategy, which to this day is still being pursued with some success. So I want to suggest to you for your consideration that a muscular international anti-corruption court could well have changed the political history of South Africa by intervening at an early stage if persuaded that complementarity was a possibility, and have diverted the decision not to prosecute Zuma, so that instead of occupying the west wing of the Union buildings, he occupied an orange set of overalls. The other example that I want to give, and I won't give as much detail because it's not nearly as interesting as the story of Jacob Zuma, is the story of Vladimir Putin in Russia. As we all know, Russia is controlled by a clique of oligarchs who have set up a kleptocracy in Russia post-Soviet Union. And when Putin became president, he arranged a show trial in the full glare of publicity of one of these oligarchs who was put into a cage and given a tremendously severe sentence for his involvement in acts of corruption. The other oligarchs were perturbed by this and went to Mr. Putin and said to him, well, what do we do to avoid this terrible fate that has befallen our colleague? And the answer was 50%. And sorry, Alison, I should have slowed that down a bit. And Mr. Putin is incredibly wealthy, and most of his wealth is in Swiss banks, Swiss banking accounts. So at the time that he decided to decided on a military exercise in Ukraine, it would have been possible, had there been an international anti-corruption court, to do a freezing order on all of his offshore assets that could be found in a country like Switzerland, which would clearly be a participant in the International Anti-Corruption Court. And I think that that may have been a factor that would dissuade an oligarch or a kleptocrat with offshore assets from getting on with that kind of show. So that's why I'm on the board of III, and that's why I believe that an international anti-corruption court is a good adornment. It is also an incentive to emerging countries to actually put proper anti-corruption machinery in place so that their leadership does not get embarrassed by being hauled before the International Anti-Corruption Court or having assets stripped and frozen by the International Anti-Corruption Court. It is a way of concentrating minds. It's the carrot and the stick, which Lee mentioned earlier, that the carrot of improving your domestic anti-corruption activities avoids the stick of the attentions of the International Anti-Corruption Court because of the way that the doctrine of complementarity works. I think that I've spoken long enough.
Thank you, Paul. Well, I see we still haven't got Lord Hain with us, and before asking for any questions, perhaps our two panelists might like to add to their remarks or to respond to what's been said so far. Mwila?
Yes. Maybe I would like to add to what Paul just said. When we read the paper that was written by Justice Richard Goldstone, one of the things that is highlighted there are some of the key questions that most people might have, as regards establishing the International Anti-Corruption Court. And one of the questions I think for me hit me so strongly is that where are we going to get the evidence from if the actual evidence that is needed to actually bring some of these leaders to books is found in the individual leader's country? So because if they run the whole entire system, where do you think the evidence is going to come from? But I think to counter that particular question, I think in recent past we have seen how certain, international cases have been able to be dealt with in one way or another. So I definitely do believe that we'll be able to counter that particular issue. And then the other issue that was also raised is that maybe IAC is also going to be too costly, taking into consideration that in 2021, approximately $1.6 million was allocated to the ICC. How possible is it that IAC is going to require so much money in order for it to function? But then again, one thing that we have to understand is that the International Anti-Corruption Court will basically depend on the domestic courthouses in a particular nation in which they are going to be delivering their agenda. Now, the other thing that I also just want to talk about is that I was on state television just 3 days ago before I came here, and I had the rare opportunity to talk about the International Anti-Corruption Court on TV. And one of the questions that I was asked, is what is the role of young leaders, in advancing the International Anti-Corruption Court, taking into consideration that the future that, we have to create is basically dependent on the youth, of today. And to answer that question, one of the things that I said is that when we take time to conceptualize, ladies and gentlemen, corruption is just as destructive as colonialism. Corruption is just as destructive as apartheid. Corruption is just as destructive as slavery. Corruption is just as destructive as COVID-19. We should not reach a point where we think corruption is not destructive. So if we can take time to introspect and understand the extent to which corruption is hindering the development of our nations, as young people will reach a point where we understand that the very moment we go head on in trying to curb the very evil aspects of corruption, we'll be able to safeguard the future of our future generations. The leaders of then, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, Kenneth Kaunda in my country, they were able to commit their lives at that moment in time to curb the atrocities in their nations because they understood that what they did at that moment in time would benefit future generations. So to all the young leaders on the African continent, in South Africa, in Zambia, we should reach a point where we understand that if we don't put our hands together to curb the atrocities that are caused as a result of corruption, we shall reach a point where in the next 10 years, we'll still reach a point where we are still telling ourselves as young leaders that corruption in itself is the wheel that drives the development of politics. And the establishment of the International Anti-Corruption Court will be able to curb some of those particular issues. Because one of the things that we have learned in recent past is that while we look forward to certain leaders and we say, this is the leader that is going to be accountable. This is the leader that is going to be transparent. This is the leader that is going to respect all the tenets of democracy. Lo and behold, they become worse than we've ever seen. So in order for us to curb that particular desire for power, as we have all read to say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, in order for us to curb ourselves from that particular agenda, it is better that we establish an institute that will specifically deal with certain areas that we fail to deal with at domestic level. And I believe that EAC will be able to also support the anti-corruption institutions in domestic countries to have their capacities built, to have, the right kind of skill that they may not have at that moment in time to deal with certain issues. So I think to add up to what Paul said, and Justice Richard Goldstone and everyone on the panel, definitely I endorse the International Anti-Corruption Court with everything that I have.
Thank you very much, Mwila. Marianne?
I understand that Lord Hain is available, and I'm very curious to hear what he, as an effective anti-corruption campaigner, through his own example of using Parliament, public shaming without an international anti-corruption court, has managed to achieve. And I'm very curious to hear his perspective on the IACC and how it may or may not, have helped or hindered the work, the incredibly effective work which he's achieved almost single-handedly with support of whistleblowers. But so please, I'd be much more interested in hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you, and I hope you can hear me okay. I'm in my House of Lords office, having caught a train to try and be with you. And I found what I've heard and read about extremely interesting. My focus, and I support the idea of an international international anti-corruption court to complement the ICC, and Gordon Brown, our former Prime Minister and Labour leader, has been campaigning for that. My focus, however, is to take action before it can get to court. And that has been why I've tried to get governments to act. Unless you get governments not just talking about anti-corruption and curbing money laundering, but actually doing it, and very few, if any of them do, then you're not really going to get a grip of this. And that's why I think it's essential for the American government, the London government, all the European governments, and the UAE government, because a lot of this money laundering and looting passes through Dubai, and the Chinese government, because a lot of it passes through Hong Kong. That's where the Guptas sent their money along together with Dubai. And the Indian government, if you look at Bank of Baroda and indeed the residency of the Guptas there, they've taken no real action. So I think the focus has also got to be, running alongside this, demanding that what may take some years to get an international anti-corruption court, that there is action by governments now. And there hasn't been, frankly.
Thank you very much, Lord Hain, for those words, and also, if I may presume, to thank you for what you've done in South Africa's interests in the House of Lords with regard to corruption. It's played a very important role. Paul, do you want to respond or add anything?
No, I'm happy.
Marianne?
No, I'm fine. I mean, I would like to hear more about the structure of the IACC and how it can prevent some of, the criticisms and the critiques of the ICC, because I think if we're going to have an IACC, we want it to be effective, because, that's what will encourage other people to join up and sign up. Or maybe not, then they'll think it's too effective, as there are other commissions of inquiry, like the Guatemalan experience, from what I understand, but that wasn't a tribunal, per se.
Professor Fakene?
Thank you very much for this illuminating input. And also greetings to Lord Peter Haynes from far away. Just two things I'm reflecting on this noble idea. The first one, you are seeing the reversal of democracy and regressions in the global system. Geopolitical divisions, which normally coincide with precisely political forces that militate against multinational organizations. Whether it's Russia, China, and others drifting in one form, the West drifting in another form, and the weakening of these multinational bodies. How do you think these can be bypassed in order to establish such a body without it being politicized or weaponized? Because when you have, if you came up in the midst of Cold War at the height of it and said, here is a grand idea, you surely know that each side would find a way to domesticate it, to weaponize it. How are we going to deal with that? Then the second one, there are cases such as your clinical trials by big pharmaceuticals that just go bribe some local community in a third world country because in their home countries, they know that this would not be allowed, the threshold would not be met. And some people just dumping the toxic waste in some country and again giving the money there. Knowing, in other words, you find countries that look neat, but they have outsourced corruption. How do we, in the architecture of this work, do we plan to deal with some of these issues? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions before
Thanks, Justice Goldstone, for that. I think I've got two questions, one for Mwila and I guess one for you as well. So to Mwila, as a young activist that also happens to be African, what would you say is the value of building national institutions to deal with corruption versus dedicating time towards international institutions? And I think something that has been already said at the onset of this debate is that sometimes the narrative around corruption can take a particular color. And in the context of global politics and geopolitics, it seems that corruption of the African color seems worse than that of other parts of the world. So how do we change that kind of thinking and transform what it means to be an African leader at the same time as supporting this initiative without being left vulnerable to being used as a vehicle for someone else's interest? So that's the first question. My second question to you, Justice Goldstone, is one, what has been the response of African states as you've engaged with them on the idea of an international anti-corruption court? And second, is there a distinction in how African jurists approach questions of international justice? So is there such a thing as international African jurisprudence? And what would the difference be? Because a conversation that's very popular for legal thinkers my age is around how do we take indigenous institutions of justice and integrate them into our constitution. And growing continentally, there's a growing movement around, okay, what does it look like as Africans to hold governments accountable? And is there a different kind of means and methodology to justice and what justice looks like? And I guess that has a good connection with the previous discussion. So maybe your thoughts around that too.
Mwila, would you like to?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll start with the question from Mike. The possibilities of us building national institutions as opposed to building international institutions. I believe we do have national institutions, if I'm not mistaken, but then again, the issue maybe that might be there is how have we built the capacity of some of these institutions? Because above and beyond, the person who sits at the helm of certain anti-corruption institutions in our countries is literally appointed by a political leader. And he that appoints you in one way or the other will intend to tell you how to play the tune. So I think the issue that comes in is that the International Anti-Corruption Court is not coming to take away power from national institutions, but to basically see how best national institution and the International Anti-Corruption Court can basically work hand in hand. So it's more like trying to build, a global and a national partnership, and then you come together to build capacity of national anti-corruption institutions and trying to see how you fill in the gaps of certain national anti-corruption institutions, as opposed to trying to say, we are literally doing away with anti-corruption bodies that sits in. We have the ICC, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we do away with our high courts, with our Supreme Courts. You basically have to see how best we work hand in hand with some of these bodies and taking into consideration that the International Anti-Corruption Court is the court of last resort. So at the end of the day, you still have the integrity of national bodies being able to play out, as they have to play out. So definitely, as opposed to us establishing institutions that intend to be dictated, by certain bodies that have their own interests and we have our own interests, it's important that we build our own capacity. But that's where the International Anti-Corruption Court also comes in. And the question on geopolitical issues, I think that's a big question, which I think I'll leave it to Paul to answer.
I understand, Lord Hain, there's a point that you would like to come in at this point?
Thank you. Yes, Peter's fine, by the way. Never mind the Lord stuff. What surprised me from the time when I was asked in 2017 to expose the activities, the looting by the Guptas and the Zumas and the rest, which I did from information supplied by sources within the South African state and others who drafted the material for me. What surprised me the more I got involved was that the campaign inside South Africa had not really gone international. And I think you're in a very, very good position to launch a campaign for an international anti-corruption court because of the horror that South Africa's been through, and using that as an example and starting to get a really active campaign going. For example, why hasn't anybody lobbied the Indian ambassador, the Chinese ambassador over Hong Kong, the UAE ambassador over Dubai? Because or London, where a lot of the money was looted through as well, despite allegedly strong anti-money laundering laws. And to target too, the banks and the global companies internationally, because they are the ones that allowed this looting to go international. And so I think there needs to be a strong campaign from within South Africa with an international objective, because you can't achieve this unless you get other countries to agree, obviously. I think you're in a strong position to do that, and it's the lack of an international campaign, rather in the way that the lack of it now compared with the anti-apartheid movement, which had a vast international reach, is very notable to me.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think it's really the politics that we're talking about, not the law. If there's a political will, one could certainly follow a lot of the funds that have been referred to in the Zondo Commission report. It's money waiting there, and it's a wasting asset. It's not going to. Each day it grows smaller as these monies are divested and spread around the world. But the politics, to come to Mike's question, is really there is a resistance, particularly from powerful states, to international courts. I mean, the United States provides a very interesting illustration. The United States certainly has supported international criminal tribunals. From my own experience with the Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunals, they wouldn't have got off their feet without support from the United States. And having got off their feet, they wouldn't have succeeded without important assistance from the United States. But when it comes to the International Criminal Court, and also no doubt with an International Anti-Corruption Court, the United States will shy away. They don't want courts that will bring United States nationals before them if they don't have the benefit of the United States Constitution and protections and jury trials and all the rest of it. This is the reality. Obviously, the United States is in a very different position from a number of other large states. China and Russia have got no conflict. From their point of view, it's a bad idea, and they won't have anything to do with it. The United States has this conflicting, almost schizophrenic view. It's a good idea, but for you, the rest of the world, you do it. We'll even pay, but don't include us in the jurisdiction of the court. And I think it's to the credit of the European nations, the large and the small, that have supported international criminal tribunals and the International Criminal Court, and I would add Canada to that list as well. And I think that's where the hope must lie. And civil society played a crucial role in setting up the international criminal tribunals that we have, and it's not only the International Criminal Court, but the so-called ad hoc courts for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and the Sierra Leone court, and the other international institutions that have been set up. But it's for civil society to press for it, and without young people, without civil society, it's not going to happen.
Yes, I think I'd really like to hear Peter on the geopolitical question that came our way from the chair of the Public Service Commission, but I'll take an amateur stab at it before a proper politician gives an answer. The truth is that after World War II and all of its horrors, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was subscribed to by most of the countries in the world, and it has almost gone out of fashion in some ways and become more fashionable in others. In South Africa, in our 1996 constitution, we have a justiciable Bill of Rights, which obliges the state to respect and protect human rights. And I want to suggest that the geopolitical changes that are going on can really be measured with the feet of poor people. If poor people's feet are pointing in the direction of a country that has respect for human rights and offers them a better life, then that is an indication of what value human rights do have. And if people in countries where human rights are being trampled are pointing their feet towards the border, that also tells you what these geopolitical trends are all about. And so I just look at the facts on the ground and work out which countries people are streaming into, as is the case in South Africa, Europe, and parts of North America. And I view the geopolitical trends in that light. Peter.
Good. Well,
I think give him a turn.
are there any further?
Oh, Peter.
To who?
Peter Hain.
Yeah, Lord Hain.
Well, Richard, just to add to that, we've got, and it has been deep-seated now for the last few years, nationalism, me-firstism replacing internationalism and multilateralism. Trump, of course, quintessentially was not an internationalist. He was an American nationalist and a me-firstist, and he despised the multilateral institutions that were built up painstakingly after the Second World War. And that's true of Putin, it's true of Xi, it's true of Modi, and it's true of Erdogan, Bolsonaro. You know, there's a long list of these guys, and they are all guys who who've come away from the internationalist perspective. So you're fighting, you're fighting a huge force. So I don't think we should be any doubt about that. But I do think that starting in Europe, and I remember when our Labour government came to power in 1997, that establishing an international criminal court was one of our priorities. But that came after a civil society campaign to put it on our manifesto commitment and agenda, and we helped achieve it. A Labour government helped achieve that in Britain. I'm not sure whether a Conservative government, perhaps in its last year or so of its life, would prioritise it, but we could focus on the Labour Party for the next general election, probably next year in Britain. So that's one thing, and to lobby European ambassadors and to get a campaign going from South Africa. As I said earlier, I think you're in a strong position to do it, but you are fighting against a background of a very reactionary climate in which internationalism and multilateralism has been replaced by nationalism and unilateralism.
Right, well, I think, Coogan.
Thanks, Peter, for your input. I think, as Richard has said, and I want to concur with him, that South Africa is indebted to you for the support you've given over the years, over the decades, but even more recently during the state capture project, you giving testimony at the Zondo Commission, but also you leading the onslaught against guilty international companies like Bain. Civil society and whistleblowers have put pressure on the business leadership, and they were not forthcoming until you led it. And after you made some impression on the British government, our government then came in and followed suit. In my recent chat with you, I indicated that there's similar pressure on another company called Hogan Lovells. Now, earlier on in the conference, we discussed the subject of NTRs, non-trial resolutions, as an incentive of bringing in private sector or enterprises at the table to try and fix up these bad practices. Perhaps, Peter, you could enlighten us on your two different approaches. One, to ban Bain, but the second one, to engage Hogan Lovells, so that we can have a better perspective as we start going on this path of trying to fix up these bad practices from these from private sector interests, but equally important, how do we fix it up and how do we seek reparations from them, but also support for and protection for whistleblowers? And you know, one of them is next door to you, Ethel, who's in self-imposed exile. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, I think Ethel Williams has been an absolute hero, and the failure of the South African business community to really acknowledge him, provide him with alternative opportunities for earning a living, I think is shameful, frankly, and needs to be remedied. And on the question you asked, Coogan, I mean, Bain, it seems to me, was one of the principal villains of the whole state capture scandal. In a way that the Zondo Commission documented, and it was specifically singled out by Zondo for prosecution and labelled as acting unlawfully. Now, that was not the case for others, including Hogan Lovells. Hogan Lovells I criticised very strongly early in 2018 and have maintained that. I referred the firm for suspension by the solicitors regulating authority, the lawyers regulating authority here in Britain, and there was a several-month investigation, and eventually they decided they didn't have a locus to act, even though they took on the case, because Hogan Lovells' typical lawyer-like defence was to say that they were an international firm for branding purposes only. Now, since then, and therefore they couldn't be held accountable in London for what happened in South Africa, and I'll come back to this point in respect to banks, because it's an absolute fallacy. Now, in the last few months, I've had the opportunity to engage in Hogan Lovells, and in fact, we've got the result of all of that, supported by the organised by the South African Chamber of Commerce, the UK South African Chamber of Commerce, and in partnership with Gibbs, has been an event on the evening of February the 15th, next Wednesday week, the 15th of February, to specifically focused on business, to admit culpability, South African business, and to say never again. So I think when you can engage with these companies, when they're willing to accept, in Hogan Lovells' case, to be perfectly frank, it was on the periphery of the whole issue. They did a whitewash report for SARS. It didn't compare with Bain's deliberate, organised, and systematic disabling of SARS on the direct instructions of former President Zuma, who they met 17 or 18 times personally. Most of them in his residence, not actually officially, and carried out his instructions dutifully for the fee that they got. And so I do think you've got to be specific about what you're demanding of these companies. And I mentioned this internationalism perspective. When I was giving evidence to the Zondo Commission, as you know, they quite rightly show written evidence to the accused individuals or companies in that written evidence, which in my case I supplied, 10,000 words of it. And they showed it to all the banks that I was castigating. Standard Chartered came back and said, their Johannesburg office said, well, the Dubai office has got nothing to do with us. We can't be held responsible for what they did after we passed all the Gupta's money through, as we did, to them to disperse. That's another jurisdiction, not me, Gov, nothing to do with me, which I regard as fundamentally unacceptable. These are international institutions. It's in the case of the banks, it's their digital pipelines through which these looted billions of rand flowed, and then to Dubai and Hong Kong, and then to be dispersed all around the world in offshore tax havens and buying property and all of that kind of thing. So I think we have to nail them. And that's why my focus has been on the international stuff, because perhaps that's where I've been able to add some value. And I think we've got to disabuse people of this notion that they can continuously shrug off responsibility and say it's nothing to do with me, when they, the Johannesburg, Standard Chartered, HSBC, Bank of Baroda officers, were up to their necks in what happened with the looted money going through.
Right, thank you very much. Just a last word for me. I would emphasise that an international anti-corruption court would be unique in the field of international criminal courts, in that there's the money to follow. In the case of war crimes courts, the crimes are committed where the war is being waged. In the case of grand corruption, in the case of kleptocracy, none of the grand corruptors, none of the kleptocrats keep the money at home for obvious reasons. They couldn't guarantee for how long the money would be accessible to them. So they launder the money in friendly money laundering states in Europe and the Caribbean and in North America. And an anti-corruption court would have the power, because some of those countries would join. And if those countries join, those monies could be followed. And that is the big distinction that certainly seems to me is there to be made in comparing an ICC with any other international criminal court. Well, it remains for me to thank our panelists, to thank Lord Hain in particular for joining us, for finding the time and the will to join us from wherever your train has recently stopped in the UK, and we hope to engage with you further on this topic. And thank you, Paul, for stepping in. And thank you all, and thank you for our audience in cyberspace.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good luck. Let's stay in touch.
Maybe just one more thing, Justice. I want to second what Peter, that's very difficult for me, it's Lord Peter, the African in me. I want to second what Lord Peter said about South Africa driving the agenda of the International Anti-Corruption Code. I think when you are in your country, it's quite difficult to see the privileges that are at your disposal. But truth be told, let me say it here. Many countries out there admire South Africa's democracy. Truth be told. In my own country, we admire South Africa's democracy. To say that you have the capacity to bring certain leaders to account. And that in itself is a strength that I believe would be an engine and a fuel to drive in the International Anti-Corruption Court, being the actual campaigner of implementing this idea of getting as many African people and as many African leaders to support such an amazing idea. So definitely I want to second what Lord Peter earlier said about South Africa being in the forefront of advancing this agenda.
Thank you. Well, I'll hand over to Paul for the last session.
Thank you. Professor Fikeni and Coogan, and these can go. Yeah. All right. Have you got the Archbishop? Yes. Thank you. Come and sit with me. You'll be safe here. I won't let anybody harm you. I'll get an interdict.
We have to look after him because he's going to fix the public service.
All right. We're just waiting momentarily, I hope, for His Grace to join us. Is the Archbishop standing by? I hear a voice there.
I'm here, Paul.
Good afternoon, Your Grace. Thank you so much for finding time to join us. I hope you've had an interesting day in front of your computer.
Yes, thank you. It's been quite educating, I must say.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask, because we are scared of the connectivity, I'm going to ask you to give your initial input first, not only because you are the senior person present, but also because you have a direct line upstairs.
Thank you so much, Paul, distinguished judges, academics, campaigners for human rights and clean government, sponsors of this event. Thank you for the privilege of inviting me to join those who are giving closing remarks to this important forum. I'm here to deliver a simple message, one that I have been preaching since it became clear that too many of our leaders had become sellouts to the struggle against apartheid, tempted by the lure of quick wealth to put us on the road to a failed state. As I said during Zuma's administration, it sometimes feels as if some of our leaders stopped their fight for a new South Africa at the point which they joined the ranks of those who corruptly and immorally amassed wealth under colonialism and apartheid. The root of our problems lies in the scandalous gap between the rich and the poor. We won political liberation nearly 30 years ago, but we have not achieved economic liberation. However, we cannot do that without doing a reboot of our politics and our instruments of governance, as most speakers have said today. So my message is this: to save South Africa, we need to embark on a new struggle to replace the old struggle against apartheid, a new struggle for a new generation, a struggle to regain our moral compass, a struggle to end economic inequity, a struggle to bring about equality of opportunity and realize the promises of our Constitution. Only by adopting this new struggle can we inspire the multitudes of disillusioned young people who despise politicians, who spurn politics, and who won't even register to vote, but instead pursue a rampant consumerism because we have failed to give them a vision which would attract them to public service. At the heart of the new struggle must, of course, be the fight against corruption, to which you have devoted today's proceedings. I won't try to cover the ground you've already discussed today, but allow me to make 3 quick points. Firstly, make no mistake, the fight against corruption will not necessarily be easier than the fight against apartheid. As we have so movingly heard today and read about in recent weeks, it takes tremendous courage to stand up against a prevailing miasma of self-serving wheeler dealing in an institution. The criminals who have engaged in and benefited from corruption will fight to stay out of prison, deploying death squads just as the criminals who enforced apartheid did. But human progress is never guaranteed without a struggle. Progress requires sacrifice, it often involves suffering, and most of all, it requires struggle. And part of that struggle must be securing better protection, as we heard today, for whistleblowers, whether from loss of income or from killers who attack in the night. That needs to happen almost immediately, and President Ramaphosa should spell out practical actions to achieve it in his State of the Nation address. Secondly, I want to endorse the call to protect law enforcement from political interference. People of all faiths share the belief that our Creator calls us to treat each other as we wish to be treated ourselves. And our priority in society should be to pursue the common good so that everyone can flourish. To pursue the common good, we need to hold one another accountable for our actions. In our national life, Chapter 9 of our Constitution gives us instruments which help us to do this. And so I believe it is actually our sacred duty to ensure that we take steps necessary to insulate investigators and prosecutors of crime from being undermined and subverted by those in power who want to cover up corruption. Thirdly, we need to create a multi-stakeholder forum to pursue the new struggle. As I've said previously, an uncoordinated constellation of independent movements is not enough. We need a coalition that embraces all voices, from the poor to the spiritual leaders of our country, to leaders of business, legal fraternity, and labor. We need an alliance of leaders and forces to say, enough is enough. That alliance must include the youth, and one of its primary objectives in securing the future should be registering young people to register to vote, then to vote, and to help change government policies, or as Lord Hain said, to lobby governments and banks, and to spearhead with their God-given energy some of the campaigns we want to do within the country and abroad. It is time to heal our political polarization and to recognize that the chasms between rich and poor cannot be tolerated any longer. The new struggle cannot be a new multiracial middle class to live as the white elite lived under apartheid. No, our struggle now must be for a new society, a more equal society, a society of equality of opportunity in which the wealth that comes from new economic growth is shared equitably among all. Our country's future, the future of our children, our grandchildren, and generations to come depend on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Grace. That's a very difficult act to follow, but I'm going to ask Professor Fikini to do his level best.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and to my fellow panelists, Your Grace and Commissioner Pillay. Indeed, after such rich inputs of today, it is very difficult to follow and reinforce. But I'll try, and it's those times you say, I have nothing to say, but I'll take my time to say so. The first thing I want to say is that out of the Zondo Commission report and several other reports into corruption and the daily reality that we have, it is quite clear that criminal syndicates are so well organized, networked, intense in their purpose. Then the rest of us who are well-meaning are so fragmented, and we dream vaguely about what we want to do, and we're often tentative. So the balance of forces is not there. That's why, Your Grace, the notion that we have entered a second phase of liberation struggle, in essence. But this time, it's focusing on anti-corruption wars, on social justice, and that's how we should take this. Because the moment you think that your constitution will roll on the wheels of inevitability without agency, then you are likely to fail. So that's the first thing. The second point I want to raise is that I use my standpoint as the chairperson of the Public Service Commission, but also I'm using my other participation in the Indlulamity South Africa Scenarios 2030, where we were analyzing what are the future trends, what will be the corruption of the future, what are the challenges that we're likely to see, so that we should put in mind. I won't dwell much on a number of things which have been said, but I'll just highlight a few. The first one, without building the weakened institutions, because when a patrimonial system or a patronage network goes up, it naturally cannibalizes institutions, weaken them. Over time, loyalty becomes the most important thing than competence. So now we have to recover that lost ground. That's why professionalization of public service becomes that much important. So that you make a distinction between an administration and a state. An administration will have a life of 5 years. It comes and goes. But there are certain institutions which must always be there. But they must be professional in nature, and they must be apolitical, and they must be able to implement the mandate of any administration. Let me give you one simple example. 6 or 7 years ago, I was invited to facilitate with others the workshop of the judiciary by the former Chief Justice and Judge Presidents on case flow management and transformation of the judiciary. It became very clear that the weakened institutions, just the interpreter in the court, the person who has to do the filing, the people who are assisting the NPA, the police, if that ecosystem is weak, you are not likely going to have watertight cases or effective investigation. That's why bringing back professionalism, where you appoint people on the basis of their competence and their professionalism, becomes probably one of the most important things we can think of, not only on the basis of delivery of services, but also on supporting the criminal justice system itself. And it is one weapon of fighting against corruption, because once you professionalize, you're squeezing the oxygen out of that system. So the Public Service Commission, after a long battle, you'll remember that Kada Asmal had proposed this professionalization of public service. There are several other reports which were led by Dr. Mapaila at one stage. The National Development Plan, Chapter 13, had talked about the building of an ethical, developmental, capable state. But during that period, the weakening of the state because of the state capture was on full force. So the time has come for us to do just that. The second part, sometime we took a decision after the anti-corruption conference where we invited Justice Zondo, Chief Justice Zondo, that we will have a 2-day workshop just focusing on the whistleblowers, investigators, and all the related parties there, on how we get all the role players to take part in an exercise which will lead to the reforms. Because we were told in that conference that we do have 2.5 billion that has been extracted through asset forfeiture. But at the same time, there is no institutional mechanism of assisting the whistleblowers when you do have this money which could actually be used. But the next point I want to raise, I do want us to see how we balance between a rules-based system where compliance and conformance has been the main thing versus a value-based system where the emphasis, of course, you need a meaningful balance, is not just on the rules, it's not just on the institutions, but on the consciousness of people, where these values and ethics become something of intrinsic, value, such that their consciousness and their behavior begin to change. I've met with the Ethics Institute of South Africa, with Father Smangalso Mkhatshwa's team of moral regeneration, with Professor Wiseman Kutlu and several other leaders of institutions to say, one, what must we do to make people who have learned something wrong in the public service to unlearn that in order to relearn new values in line with what we want to do? Secondly, what must we do to make sure that in the whole ecosystem, from the education system to our business schools, to our universities, we make sure that the issue of instilling the right values and ethics is part of the menu, because mainly some of the people who are appearing in the Zondo Commission, some of the people responsible for the 2008 global financial crisis are smart people, technically sound, but their character is flawed. So how do we deal with that balance? But the issue of extreme inequality provides an ethical dilemma that we should begin to wrestle with. I'll just give you this one example and stop. During Christmas, I was in my village in the Alfred Nzo district for 2 weeks. Load shedding was extreme. The neighbor had just slaughtered a sheep, bought grocery, then the electricity tripped. And they tried to call the toll-free number, Telkom. No one came. And others said, no one will ever come. What did they do? I asked them, how did you solve the problem? No, we called the local boys who know something about electricity. He climbed up the pole, he put the switch up. Technically, that could be irregular. But morally, here are people who are to lose everything they have. And I've been checking with them up to this day to say they were given the reference number every day. Up to today, no one from Eskom has come to repair that pole. So we shouldn't at times create a situation out of these extreme cases where people run into the hands of, those people who may play a role of assisting them because institutions are weak. We've also established a forum. In fact, the forum is already there, of Chapter 9 institutions, Chapter 10 institutions, and Chapter 13 institutions, where we've decided it might take longer to have political reforms and therefore have leadership that might be coherent. And not only that, we might be moving towards coalitions. And those coalitions, we have seen in the cities what they do. The faster we have the reforms and build the institutions that are insulated from such shocks, the better. Because in such instances, you'll continue to have the functioning of the state. Even in the event you do have those political tremors. In Belgium, I understand at one stage they had 540-something days without any government because of the coalition problems. But because they had a layer of professional public service, services were going on. And we must begin to think creatively of that particular scenario. I would have added more, but due to time, I think I'll just stop here to say, with the Public Service Commission, we're extending our hand to civil society organizations. We've already been calling and working together because we realize that the problems we have are compounded. It cannot take government alone to make them work. We must build the capacity of citizens, build the capacity of institutions, whilst we're hoping for the capacity of leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Yes, of course. Or you can stand there if you prefer.
I think just to be able to see the screen from there.
Oh, you want to see the screen?
Otherwise, by the time I drive to the airport, my eyes are going to be looking at
There's a mic here. Logan, there's a mic here. You can use that one. Right. Last but not least, Coogan Pillay.
Just the height of the chair. Okay. Am I looking? All right, that's fine. Doesn't matter. Thanks, Program Director and colleagues. As you can see, I've been limited to the last session. Microphone. Yes. I've got to do some multi-skilling here. So, colleagues, I was asked to do some roundup comments on the last panel. And so, briefly, I put a few slides together. And essentially what I want to cover is the inputs from the various panels. And then some possible next steps. But I also think it's important to give some context. So I'm going to do a bit of background, a bit of some context, the present context, and then going into the panels, and then finally opportunities and challenges. So I came in a bit late this morning from the airport, but I'm not sure if the organizers or yourselves have commended this great leader, Oliver Tambo, and why we are here. We are in the Tambo Moot Court venue. And as L.B. Sachs has spent time alongside Oliver Tambo, and he describes, if you look at the DNA of the Constitution, you'll see the DNA of Oliver Tambo. So incidentally, 2 days ago, we commemorated the 26th anniversary of the Constitution. And if you look at the brochure you have, there's a cartoon in the back of it. The Constitution has been hailed by global leaders on the best Constitution we have, and yet equally important, the question that we ask is why leaders don't stick to the Constitution and the rule of law. So Oliver Tambo set the process while still in exile with L.B. Sachs. Mandela came in 1994, and that was his constitutional promise of freedom, equality, and dignity. Those were the ideals of the Constitution. But as you know, it was interrupted by the state capture and grand corruption project. And some of the colleagues called it a human rights issue because these are the basic rights that were entrenched in the Bill of Rights. And later on, as you know, Ramaphosa spoke about corruption being the single biggest threat to our democracy. Hence the theme of this conference, Countering the Corrupt, and Paul Hoffman's book on that. Chief Justice Zondo also spoke about the massive deficit in integrity and accountability, hence the sub-theme, Reforming the Criminal Justice Administration. So let's look at the present context. And you've heard it from all the speakers, most recently now with Professor Fikeni and Archbishop Makoba. We are the most unequal society in the world, 28 years after democracy. And that must be an indictment against us and society at large. We have a multiplicity of crises and pandemics at the moment. State capture, we had COVID. COVID was not man-made. The rest are all man-made. And if you remember Mandela's comments, all these man-made crises, it's up to us, men and women, to fix them. We've got escalation of crime and corruption, load shedding, poverty, unemployment, education, healthcare, high cost of living, citizen protests, violence, example, gender-based violence, slow pace or absence of government response. South Africa is a state under siege. If we have the army to patrol Eskom and power stations, if we have the army to escort Eskom employees, we're talking about sabotage and theft at Eskom and other SOEs. We're talking about threats and assassination of whistleblowers, counselors, university academics, SAPS, and can you imagine 6 bodyguards for the University of Fort Hare Vice-Chancellor? It tells you we're a society gone very wrong. And you've heard Archbishop Makoba talking about the moral crisis. So there's growing citizen anger. There's a SONA on Thursday, and on Wednesday evening, I'll send you the invitation later on, there's a civil society, real State of the Nation address, and it's important that we heed what civil society is saying. So civil society, there's a tsunami that's brewing at the moment. You might remember former President Thabo Mbeki in July last year warning of a potential Arab Spring. And then we also have apartheid-era privileges that have crept into the democracy. Leaders versus citizens. You have free electricity and water for leaders, yet there's excessive executive remuneration. The latest increase in Eskom tariffs, while at the same time not delivering on the service. And I'm sure most of you have seen in the last week the SA tourism debacle, which Ben spoke about earlier, the 1 billion rand deal with Spurs. All this while stage 6 power blackouts are happening. And then recently we also saw the headlines of the excessive CEO remuneration of 300 million rand for one person. So let's look at the panels today and kind of a summary. So essentially, countering the corrupt, we're looking at reforms to the criminal justice administration. I missed the minister's address and the other addresses, but I'm sure I would have covered the essence of it. Zondo spoke about industrial-scale fraud, looting, corruption, massive deficit of integrity. You might remember Ramaphosa, when receiving the final Zondo report, spoke about a deep sense of shame, embarrassment, and betrayal, and hence called for societal intervention. And that's why we are here as part of a collective of civil society organizations. Zondo recommendation was for part of his recommendation included an anti-corruption agency, which was deliberated earlier on, whistleblower protection and support, a procurement agency, a real look at the appointment of boards, including cadre deployment, looking at electoral reform to advance accountability, and I think Lawson spoke about that earlier. Zondo also spoke about the critical role of whistleblowers, and he said if we do not support them and do not protect them, they will not come again. You've heard that over last weekend's papers, the PIC whistleblower, when the media questioned her, she said she'll think twice about it. Martha Ngoya has just won how many cases? Back at work, and they are looking at reprisals again against her. And you might remember Winnie Mandela. They showed a film recently, and the question to her was, would you do it again? And she said, I'm not sure. I think that's where we come together. Given Peter Hain's input, Prof. Fikeni and Archbishop Makoba, and as Archbishop Makoba said, we have no right but to protect our kids, our grandchildren, and future generations. So he spoke about the critical role of whistleblowers. We spoke about an anti-corruption agency, and as Paul spoke about STIRS, and there was a motion this morning from Lawson to include A for accountability. So Paul, we have to change your acronym to STIRS, include an A. Implementation of the Glenister judgment, and then we need innovative measures. We spoke about the NTRs. You heard Peter Hain's view on two different approaches, Bain versus Hogel's, and I think it's important because we're talking about a just energy transition. The time is now to start implementing it. Besides the just energy transition, government is talking about a national health insurance, which is the budget equivalent to Eskom budget. And if we do not put these systems in place, you can imagine what's going to happen. And then we spoke about repatriation of stolen monies. I know Paul has put this figure before, 1.5 trillion. We've heard about lessons of Bain and Hogel. But Paul, it's encouraging to see what the NPA is doing. It's encouraging to see what the SIU is doing. But they're talking about a few million a year, doesn't talk anywhere close to one. And I think that's the importance of this kind of forum, because we are not just civil society, we are professional, we're qualified, we've been around. How do we help government to get back that money so it can be pumped back into your hospitals, into your load shedding, into all of these development areas? Another important measure that came out earlier was performance agreements, performance-based remuneration, and consequences for non-performers. In other words, we've seen about 10 ESCOM CEOs in the last 15 years. They've all taken massive bonuses, and we are sitting with a mess now. It is nice to get that money back. And I think the most recent one, this 1 billion rand, is a good example. You have a minister there, you have a board there, you have a president. They all are not talking to each other, and we are paying the price of it. And then there's, I think, the comments from Advocate Saliso about reports from the DOJ to be discussed in Parliament, and it should be in the public domain. Because I think for us to hold government to account, I think Professor Tuli Malansola spoke previously about having these minutes out in the public domain so we can manage and we can monitor. It doesn't make sense for the president to fly an FT with the British king when he's got an ambassador there who could do that. And I think those resources are more needed here. So what do we need to do to fix it? We need institutional support. We need a capable and ethical state to govern efficiently and to produce and to deliver services. And Prof. Fikeni's touched on that. It's in the NDP, it's in the UN SDGs. How do we make sure these things happen? So the first thing is to implement the Zondo recommendations. We need to get involved, and we need to look at timeframes and processes. In that regard, some of us are working with Prof. Fikeni and other institutions because we don't want a repetition of the TRC that took 20 years, and they have now got another commission, and quite a few of these crooks have all passed away. And then the principles of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and the next. Firoz is gone already, but the next has got 6 pillars. And part of it is a societal approach, as we spoke about, strategic collaboration, partnerships to address the remaining, the reclaiming of captured, failed institutions. I think Archbishop Makopa spoke about a multi-stakeholder collaboration, government, business, civil society, Chapter 9 institutions, such as the PSC, the UNDP, and Richard spoke about the IACC. I think, all these are important things. We need to give it life. It was good to hear the young voice from Zambia. A lot of passion, a lot of energy, a young voice, and also a part of Africa. So we need to make sure these things happen. Prof. Fikeni spoke about professionalizing, and Prof, you notice I didn't take notes. I didn't do, this presentation was done before you gave input. So part of it we said is professionalizing capacity in the public service, and rebuilding and rebuilding dynamic institutions with the focus on efficient governance and service delivery. And then I think, Prof. Fikeni, you spoke about a values-based leadership encompassing morality, ethics, and integrity. Archbishop Makopa spoke about it. The UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed at last year's Mandela lecture spoke about that, or the Bishop Tutu lecture. And we spoke earlier about political will. I mean, really, the political will, we've got a consensus, and that consensus is the Constitution. The political will should be aligned to the constitutional imperatives. We've done a couple years of negotiation with all the parties, and as Kalema Motlanthe said, the ANC's constitution should be aligned with the country's constitution. So quite frankly, it should be aligned with the constitution. And as Prof. Fikeni spoke about professional versus factional, and if you remember the July 2021 insurrection, the high-level panel reported that the single biggest factor was the dysfunction in the ANC. So the factionalism in the ANC is resulting in the broken governance. Citizens are paying the price for it. And I think, as Peter Hain said, this is the time for us, and we need to really rise up. Opportunities, challenges, and next steps coming out of this. So it's urgent to prevent a total state failure and collapse. Some of them believe it has happened already when you have load shedding, you have water shedding, you have killings on a daily basis, assassinations. And if you remember, Bishop Tutu spoke about this in 2018, and we've heard earlier, Clem Sante in his scenario planning also spoke about that. Use of law for social justice. And I think that goes to Tambo. I think Chaskelson, Saliso spoke about this morning. As opposed to the present leaders, they use law to evade justice. And we've seen it to the president, we've seen the public protector, we've seen it to Justice Sloper. So we have to look at these things. Innovative solutions in the interest of the people. We spoke about NTRs, whistleblowing, and I think Richards was on the IACC. We must support him to make sure this takes off. Policy options and tools. There's lifestyle audits, there's NDA, lovely political statements we hear every now and again, but we never see any carry through any implementation of this. Zondo on electoral reform for accountability. You've seen Parliament dithering over that for 2 years. The Concord gave them a 2-year deadline. They couldn't even get that together. So really, Parliament is seriously compromised, and we cannot leave it in the hands of the ANC. Performance-based remuneration, perverse incentives. We've seen perverse incentives, golden handshakes, Stalingrad tactics, indefinite. I think, Prof. Fikeni, you spoke about suspension on pay. We've seen people sitting on the payroll for more than 10 years. So, and this is all money that could be used for development. International best practices. We've got experience from other jurisdictions like the US. I was very amazed to see Swedish youth take on the Swedish government on climate non-action. We've heard earlier from John's group on the bread cartel. And then there's a Canadian class action on discrimination and economic exclusion. And then we've seen Richard's IAC. But this economic exclusion applies to whistleblowers. They've put their lives out, and the families have been ostracized, and they've been excluded. Whistleblower support, review of institutional mandates. I think Celisa spoke about the Human Rights Commission, Public Protector, and other. Challenges of the structure of economy. We heard, I think, people talking about greed, the colonial era privileges, and Guterres spoke about it, and Bishop Tutu spoke about it previously. Engagement, what we need to do, next steps. Engagement with NACAC, engagement with DOJ, other key stakeholders, and then we need to go to the streets. We need to tell people, these people are wasting our time. They're taking money, and we're not seeing any value. Lessons, what we need to do, Prof. Fikeni, we need to talk about this. Lessons, case studies from NTR and TRC for Zondo. Reparations for whistleblowers. We need to see reparations for whistleblowers. We need to see consequences for the enablers and perpetrators of state capture, including repatriation of those stolen public monies, I think an estimated of 1.5 trillion. And I think Peter Hain is a useful ally to have. He's done this mobilization. You've seen the moment he opened his mouth, the next thing South African government followed on. And I think we need to look at allies like that to help us. Then there's accountability for failed policy. When policies fail, they impact citizens. What was encouraging during the COVID crisis was Pope John Paul, I don't know the number, sorry about that, but Pope basically did not fire any staff. He dropped the salaries and he kept everybody employed. What did we see in South Africa? Stealing of money is meant for the poor, meant for medical. So I think that's very important that these funds are accounted for. So if there's failed policy, there should be impacts on that. And as I go on, just a few slides. So this is from former President Barack Obama. So whistleblowers, why is it so important? Because they play a useful role, not just blowing the whistle on wrong behavior, but we're supposed to be consulted by government. Do you see any consultation? 94 was meant to be consultation. Unfortunately, we've lost all those good leaders, Mandela, Tambo, more recently Tutu, Frene Janwala. Janwala created an inclusive parliament. Do you see an inclusive parliament now? You know, Mbeki remarked on that last year when he said, you don't see this inclusivity. So I think that's useful. If the US can get it right, I'm sure we can take some lessons from there. And then again, as Mandela said, he's done his bit, it's up to us. So I think this, Paul and Richard and the other partners, this is an amazing start. I was a bit cautious whether Minister Lamola will attend, and thanks, he attended. He even sent his DG. We have Prof. Fikeni here, the new head of the PSC. I think it's up to us to realize Mandela's ideals. And where does it start? It needs some concrete action. So it's all over there in the Zondo report. We need to give it some life. If we don't do that, what's going to happen? This is what's going to happen. And John, thanks for this cartoon. If you remember the bread cartel, the rich are going to be eating, the poor are going to be starving, and you're going to worsen poverty, unemployment, inequality. And we can't let that be our legacy. My final slide I want to wrap up. I like this quote by Gandhi. The world is big enough to satisfy everyone's needs, but will always be small enough for everyone's greed. How true. And bad things happen when good people don't do anything. And I think based on this year, we can't let this happen on our watch. And as Gandhi said, the future depends on what we do in the present. Thank you, Program Director.
Thanks. Thank you very much indeed. Your timing is excellent. You've left me exactly 2 minutes to wrap up, and that's what I'm going to do. I think that what I take home from today is that Professor Kachalia has an open mind as to what needs to happen next in the deliberations of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. Minister Lamola does not know the difference between the non-binding minority judgment in Glenister 2 and the binding majority judgment in that case. And we're going to have to decide how we deal with that, because it is vital that the state should understand, the minister should understand the difference between what was said by the Chief Justice for a minority and what was held by the Deputy Chief Justice and Justice Cameron for the majority in Glenister 2. So we've all got to go back and read that again. I'm very happy to please Lawson and make stirs into stairs, and A for accountability, the middle, well, I suppose the third letter in stirs. On the whistleblowing front, I really ask those intimately involved in the whistleblowing field to give serious consideration to the idea of an ombud. I pointed you all in the direction of the Schleswig-Holstein example, which is in the book Countering the Corrupt, and I think we could do it quickly in South Africa if we got on with it. NTR sound very exciting, and I think a lot of homework needs to go into preparing the ground for it, because Lee Bozalek is absolutely right. It doesn't work with only a carrot. You have to have a stick as well. And a stick in this case is a functioning criminal justice administration that is able to deal with serious corruption, which we've identified as cases involving more than 10 million rand. Everybody in this room probably knows that we have put out into the public domain a draft constitutional amendment which fixes up the status of the NPA and lays the basis for a Chapter 9 anti-corruption body and enabling legislation accompanying that. If you haven't looked at it yet, look at it now and come and tell me what's wrong with it, because I can't see what's wrong with it yet, but that might be because I'm biased. The last aspect that I do need to draw to the attention of this audience and the audience in cyberspace is that we chose the OR Tambo moot court for the specific reason that you find on the last page of your conference brochure, where Tambo, shortly before his death in 1993, said, "The fight for freedom must go on until it is won, until our country is free and happy and peaceful as part of the community of man, we cannot rest." I wrote a gloss on that earlier today. PS, PS, PS. I'll buy a beer for whoever can remember accurately what PS, PS, PS stands for. And it was 2007 when Kgalema Motlanthe noted, and he was Secretary General of the ANC at the time, "This rot is across the board. It is not confined to any level or any area of the country. Almost every project is conceived because it offers opportunities for certain people to make money. A great deal of the ANC's problems are occasioned by this." How right he was, how serious it is that we need to give attention to that problem, because if we don't, the alternative is indeed too ghastly to contemplate. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to those in cyberspace who have remained on course throughout. I think it is now time to switch off the machines and start the after party. Thank you.